finding Daniel, book of Daniel, chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3, and we've been looking at the narratives in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and we've been discovering wise lessons from Daniel and his friends. And we found several truths, several lessons, and they're profound, but they're not always connected. They're timely, but one may not have anything to do with the other, and that's going to be what we find today also. There is a central truth that we discover through these 6 chapters, and that is this: it is possible to live a godly life, a God-honoring life, in a culture and in a society that has absolutely no regard for God, for the things of God, or for God's people. That truth has been shown so far in the king's diet, and then last week in the king's dream, and today we're going to see it in the king's statue. And today we're going to look at a story that we learned when we were little children. Daniel is not mentioned, but the lesson is taught us from Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. And as I said last week, even if you're someone who doesn't believe the Bible, this is a great story just for the entertainment factor. So I hope at least you can get some entertainment out of this today. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Now this little story takes place 20 years after the story in our previous message of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He dreamed about a statue that had a gold head, and he and Babylon was the gold head. This statue is unrelated to the statue in his dream, but it does show that Nebuchadnezzar did indeed have a big head, evidenced by what he did. He built a huge statue. In the King James, the word is image. It speaks of an idolatrous figure. Not a god, but a reminder of, or a representative of, a little g god. And listen, this image thing, this idol thing, is never a good idea. Even God, even Yahweh, prohibited images that reminded people of Him, the true God. And the problem is that an image can become a god. It can be something that we worship, and that's not a good thing. Well, the statue was constructed, and Nebuchadnezzar had it placed not in Babylon, not in downtown Babylon among all the high buildings, but on, the Bible says, on the plain of Dura. This was a very large, flat area with no trees, so anyone far or near would be able to see the statue. It was a magnificent, impressive structure. Now, this could have been an image of the king's favorite god, but theologians believe that most likely it was an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself. So here, out in the middle of nowhere, there's this great, big, 90-foot, bigger-than-life statue of Nebuchadnezzar's favorite king himself. And the area would accommodate lots of people. Everybody could have a good seat. Everybody could see. The image could be seen by all. Well, after the image was completed, King Nebuchadnezzar thought that it would be a good idea to have a dedication service. At least that's what the people thought when they received the invitation. Everybody who was somebody and everybody who was nobody, they were invited. They got an invitation. You see, there were many people in battle. This was one of the wise things the king did. Many people from conquered nations. Some were in his training program. Some were in places of authority. But the nation was filled with all nationalities and a whole lot of races. There were a diverse group. And everybody got an invitation. And no RSVP was required because it was just expected. It was a given that if you got an invitation, you were going to be there. It was an invitation from the king. So it came a day, and they all assembled around this statue for the festivities. They were chit-chatting. They were talking about the magnificent structure, probably talking about how it resembled the king, and wondered why exactly were they there and what was going to take place. And suddenly they discovered the king's true motive. There was a man that came out with a megaphone, and he gave this command of the king. Whenever you hear instruments play, whenever you hear music, whenever you hear noise, that's a cue to bow down to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. You see, the King Nebuchadnezzar was dead set on everybody worshiping and everybody bowing down to this image. So much so that a threat was included. Verse 6, anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. And we're going to see what the word immediately means in just a moment. Now, it was like there was this big statue out in the middle of nowhere, and around it were all these benches, these pews maybe, or seats with kneeling benches in front, and to the side there was a crematory, a blazing furnace. The King James says a fiery furnace for those people who just would rather not bow down. So the invitation was, you can sit over here in these comfortable seats, or you can sit over there where it's rather hot. Now this week I attended a graveside service for the mother of a pastor friend of mine. It was at 2:30 in the afternoon. It was 93 degrees and the sun was shining. And it just verifies, and you can give me credit for this quote: cemeteries are the hottest and the coldest places on the face of the earth. And it was hot on this day. It was a great service for a great lady. The people that spoke had great things to say. I'm glad that I went, but it was very lengthy. And by the time it was over, everybody was soaked. It was hot. But not as hot as this special seating area for those who refused to bow down to the statue. And probably the people could see the flames coming out as the command was given. These people from many nations and religions who had pledged their allegiance to various territorial gods of their homeland, they didn't have a whole lot of time to decide. After the command, Nebuchadnezzar waited maybe a couple of minutes, and then he motioned for the band leader. Verse 7. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed down to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Well, we could say this is a great story so far, but it would be sad if it was at the end, but it wasn't the end. But as far as we've gotten so far, there are some great truths that we can extract before moving on. And so let's talk about those. Here's the first one, and it's from a negative example. Standing firm in our faith includes true worship. It requires true worship experiences. If we're going to be people who stand firm in our faith in Christ, then we're going to have to be people who on a regular basis encounter God in worship, true worship. The word worship here means to pay homage to. These are actions that show reverence, honor, respect, admiration, esteem, and adulation. It is showing whoever or whatever we're worshiping that they are bigger and better and more powerful than we are, to such a point that we feel like we need to take some sort of action, physical action, in this case, bowing down. And the king wanted all to worship and revere the image that that he had made. But here's one thing we can say absolutely for sure. Even if they bowed down, they really weren't worshiping. They were not stating that this image or the man that the image represented was worthy of worship. We get some insight into true worship. As Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well, he says, "For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." And so we learn from this story some lessons about worship. First of all, true worship has God as its object. Jesus says those who worship him. In true worship, whatever we're worshiping, whatever we're bowing down to, as an object, it must be someone worthy of our worship, someone bigger than us, someone better than us, someone or something we truly admire and respect. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here today to worship God. And this God is the one transcendent God. He is bigger. He is better than us in every way. He has all power, all knowledge. Out of his great love for us, he selflessly gave his son so that we might have life. And so we can truly worship him today. We can focus in on him only because of who he is and because of what he has done for us. See, on the plain of Dora, no matter how big, no matter how impressive the statue was, people were bowing down to something created rather than the creator. And so there is no way that could have been true worship. Here's the second thing we learn about worship. True worship is something that happens on the inside. Jesus said it happens in spirit. Now, many, especially today, with what's going on in churches today, with all the worship wars going on, many confuse true worship by what they see, or what they do, or what they see people do. All the things that are going on, all the things we do in a worship service. But we can't go by that. We can't see things like that and be certain that people have worship. If we could say this: the people on the plain of Dora on this day were worshiping. Look, there was hype. There was a lot of excitement. There was music. There were instruments. There were people bowing low to the ground. Looking from the outside in, it looked like people were truly worshiping, but what they were doing was just like we do very often, and that is just to go through the motions of worship. Today we have traditional worship, and we have contemporary worship, and we have casual worship. But those are just terms that speak of the motions of worship. That's all. Worship is something that happens on the inside. It happens in spirit. It's something that happens between us and God. And by the way, you can have a casual worship service, but true worship is never casual. Now, personally, I think our in-spirit worship of God should be a little more demonstrative. There should be an excitement in not acknowledging what God has done for us, but just because we're not doing that. If we're sitting reverently on a chair or in a pew, that doesn't mean that worship is not happening. And those churches where people lift their hands and dance around when they sing, that doesn't mean that true worship is happening. Worship is something that happens on the inside. Here's another thing about worship. True worship cannot be forced. Nebuchadnezzar had this hot furnace over there to entice people to bow down. But even if they did bow down, it doesn't mean they worship, because we cannot force people to worship. Parents, we need to encourage our children and our teenagers to come to church and to go to a worship service. And that's a good thing. That's good parenting. That's bending children in the right way. But even if we demand it, even if we can't make them worship. We can insist they sit reverently, pay attention to the preacher, and sing, but we cannot make them worship. That is something on the inside that's done voluntarily between us and God. True worship cannot be compromised. That's something else we can learn about worship. It keeps its focus on this one thing, on this one object. especially when our worship is directed at the one true God. See, God himself, with his finger on tablets of stone, wrote these words that had great meaning to the people then and should have great meaning to us today. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. You see, in this story, with all these people, all this diverse group from all over the known world, every person, every race, every nationality, every religion, they all compromised their faith when they bowed down to this image that Nebuchadnezzar has built. One last truth about worship. True worship unites people. If a church gathers, and when that church gathers, they worship the one true God, it will bind us together. True worship fuels us to be about God's business, but it also turns us into fellow workers and fellow worshipers. This was possibly Nebuchadnezzar's purpose in this. He was a smart man in many ways. He knew about worship. He knew this: if he could get all these diverse people who had differences to worship the same God, it would provide some degree of peace and unity among the nations he ruled. Only thing is, it won't work if people are forced to do it. Look with me at verse 8. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the golden statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon, and they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Standing firm in our faith has costs. That's our second truth for today. Standing firm in our faith has costs. Now, Daniel and his friends, we've already said, had already determined in their hearts, back in their homeland, that they were going to stand firm regardless of the cost. There are costs involved. Whenever we stand firm, we're probably going to find ourselves facing the cost of being in the minority. And let's face it, we say we like to be different from everyone else. We want to have our own look. We don't want to drive the same car everybody else drives, but in reality, all of us want to fit in. You see, we want to be different, but not to the point where it moves us from the majority to the minority. Now you think about these masses that were gathered on the plain of Dora around this image. When the music played, the Bible says that all the people bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue. Now Nebuchadnezzar is probably sitting high up, looking down on the crowd, because if he had been at ground level, he would have noticed that there were three people not kneeling, but still standing, sticking out like a sore thumb and not bowing down. The great majority on that day bowed down. A very small minority, just 3 men, did not do so. There are often consequences of being in the minority. For example, we will not be popular with others. We might be ridiculed and ostracized. And even, it's so bad that even if someone in the majority is seen talking to someone in the minority, they're accused of also being in the minority or at least sympathetic. Don't plan on winning friends and influencing people if you have moved from the majority to the minority. And often, very often, the majority will want to stamp out the minority, especially, as in the case of Daniel's friends, when the minority has had some degree of success. Like them, will be slandered by tattletales with half-truths. Now, the king's advisors, we learned about them already. There were some astrologers, some enchanters, some sorcerers, and some musicians. And when he had the dream, when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, he called all the groups in, but it was Daniel, who was in the scientific group, who was able to tell him the dream and interpret it. And because of this, and because of things that happened along the way, there was a great amount of rivalry and envy and jealousy between these groups. They would try to discredit the others and put their group in the prominent position. So it was the astrologers, the Bible says, who ratted out Daniel's friends. As they bowed down, as many times we do, some folks, when you pray, you keep one eye open and you look around, and that's what they were doing, and they noticed these three still standing. And they did not like this group, because this group of men had shown them up time after time. Verse 12. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. Now, here's the thing about this accusation. It's not entirely true. Yes, they would not bow down. Yes, they would not serve the king's gods. But this term, they pay no attention to you, or have not regarded you, in the King James, was absolutely false. That word regarded is the same word that speaks of a barren woman. And the accusation was this: King, these men are barren of respect for you. Now here's the facts. These three men, they weren't chummy with the king, but they admired him. And they respected him. And the king could count on them. They had a record of being good workers and being obedient to the king. So the astrologers stepped in and used an incriminatory device still used today, although they twisted it around just a bit. And that is a partial truth. Some bit of the truth makes a lie more believable. When we place ourselves in the minority, we put ourselves at risk. Our reputation, our career, our social standing, our lives. Now, probably the king knew these men. He knew about these men. He knew they were good men. He knew he could count on them. And so, because of that, he gave them one more chance to bow down, or else the blazing furnace. The command of the king was law. When you refuse to believe, when you refuse to obey the king, then you paid the price. It was a very serious thing. It's called civil disobedience. Whenever we disobey human authority, whenever we disobey the laws of the land. Peter and the apostles were hauled into court, and they were told, you guys need to stop preaching about Jesus. And Peter gave this reply, which has become a principle in the Christian life. We must obey God rather than any human authority. But with this pandemic going on, with all the governmental orders that are given out, and they're different in every state and a lot of municipalities, we see a lot of civil disobedience. We see a lot of people defying the law of the land, of human authority. And we see a lot of Christians do it. And we see a lot of pastors do it. And we see a lot of churches doing it. Listen, the Bible does present a legitimate case for civil disobedience, but it must be something that completely conflicts with our faith, and it must be something done as absolutely a last resort. Maybe you've read in the news the last couple of weeks about John MacArthur. John MacArthur is the pastor of Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California. He's a noted theologian and preacher with a big, big following. And he and his elders made a statement that they were going to disobey the California order for groups not to meet. And they did. 2 or 3 Sundays ago, they met for the first time in this huge sanctuary. Thousands of people. I don't know how many before the pandemic. They were running 8,000 on Sunday morning. I saw the pictures. These people were sitting next to each other with no masks on. They defied the order. And his reasoning was they cited some conspiracy theories. They gave statistics. They gave the death rate with absolutely no compassion or sympathy for those that died. And they also quoted Peter's statement, we must obey God rather than any human authority. And since they've been doing this, which I believe is going to come back and bite them in a big way, many have shown their support, including Franklin Graham. And let me just say this. Personally, I think it was very unwise. It was a knee-jerk reaction capitalizing on this church's size and the preacher's popularity. Listen, the government is not trying to shut down the church. These are temporary restrictions, and that is not good enough reason nor serious enough to disobey human authorities. Listen, those Christians that live in those nations that prohibit the church from existing, who meet underground, who are persecuted if they're caught, who have their lives at risk, that's biblical civil disobedience, not this. I read this opinion piece that I had a statement that I agree with. John MacArthur loves the Bible, but he does not love his neighbor. And listen, it must be about loving our neighbor. You see, we can get all high and mighty and standing our ground on some doctrine, but it's never right if we put our neighbor at risk. The Bible also says that if you disobey human authority, even if it's legitimate, you must face the consequences. I assure you that Mr. MacArthur and his elders and his church are doing everything they can to fight the consequences of what they are doing. North Point pastor Andy Stanley, pastor of the second largest church in America, has taken a different strategy. And so are other pastors, including the president of our convention. No worship services in-house until 2021. Their reasoning, we've got to keep our people safe and healthy. That's loving our neighbor. You know, I'm so glad that we can do that. But we can only do it because it's permitted in our state and because of our size and the fact that we can socially distance very easily. It's good to assemble and worship. It's something we must do. It's something we need to do. But ladies and gentlemen, even when we can, the church is no less the church. The church remains the church. But when there is just cause, and we stand firm, and the result is civil disobedience, we face the consequences, and that's what these three men did. Nebuchadnezzar brought the matter into a whole nother realm when he threatened the three, and then he tacked this little thing on. And then, what God will be able to rescue you from my power? The king thought no God could do it. And this obviously stirred something deep within the hearts of these Hebrews, these people who knew what their God could do, and apparently also got the attention of Yahweh himself. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. And he will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. And ladies and gentlemen, that is justified civil disobedience. They had, over their lives, they'd seen what God could do. They had seen things happen that they could only explain in terms of God. So in no uncertain terms, these three in unison say that under no condition and no threat will they ever bow down to that image. See, here's our third truth. Standing firm in our faith provides opportunities to testify about our God. They tell their king what they're not going to do, and in the same statement, 3 times they make reference to their God. The God whom we serve. He will rescue us, and even if he doesn't. They're respectful when they talk to the king, but they let him know that it's not about them. This thing is about their God, the one true God. Another principle. Standing firm in our faith is the result of an absolute trust in God. We hear it. We hear it in their declaration. Their faith, their confidence in God was so strong, they didn't care what God would do or what God wouldn't do. They must remain faithful. We do not need to defend ourselves before you. The King James has it more literal. We are not careful to answer you in this matter. We don't need to care. It's not an important factor here. It's not needed in our reply. We don't even have to think about it. It's something that we've already decided. We will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue. And their faith did not waver. There's something else about their faith. The God whom we serve is able to save us, but even if he doesn't. Listen, they found themselves in a place where we often find ourselves when we pray. We are unsure of God's willingness, but we are absolutely sure of God's ability. Their faith was not in God's willingness because they did not know what God was going to do. They did not know if God was willing, but they knew their God was able. And that's just cause for faith. Their faith in God was so firm that they didn't care whether or not God would rescue them from the fire. They knew that one way or the other, through them living or dying, he will rescue us from your power. They trusted God either way. Alive or dead, they would no longer be subject to the king. They had the assurance that even in this next life, that God was going to continue to care for them. And somehow, in some way, whatever the result, it would fit into God's plan, and God's plan and God's will was more important than life itself. Now this brings us to what J. Vernon McGee, the late radio preacher, would say, where the shoe leather hits the road in our community. Is our faith, is our confidence in God at a level where we could make this same statement they did in a similar situation? Do we believe that God has a plan that's worth us losing our life over? Do we believe that Jesus is preparing a place for us in heaven? A little over a year ago, my mentor, Ernest Walker, my pastor, was told by the doctors that he was terminal, would not live very long, and I went to visit him. And in that conversation, he said this, "Arnold, you know me. This doesn't faze me at all. This is just another great adventure, one that I've been planning on, and one that I've been expecting." Now, what faith could make a statement like that? And he kept that faith to his last breath. Well, we find that Nebuchadnezzar was a man of his word. Verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and then he ordered some of the strongest men of his armies to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. All this was happening on the very same day. You see, back then, justice was not drawn out. There wasn't appeal after appeal after appeal. When the king or when the judge said a person was guilty, the punishment was carried out immediately. That's what the king had promised. And that's why the writer tells us that they were tied up while they were still dressed in pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. There was no time to change into crematory garb. But there was a slight delay because the king wanted the fire a little hotter. And so he heated the fire 7 times the normal temperature. It was hot. It was so hot that soldiers that got near the flames lost their lives. Now, there's a couple of things, a couple of good comments I think we can make about this extra hot fire. First of all, it was not wise thinking on the king's part. Not if he wanted these men to suffer. If he wanted them to suffer, he should have cooled the fire down rather than to heat it up. Those people who were executed by being burned on the stake, they weren't put on a pole on top of a fire. The fire was started later, and it kindled, and it progressed slowly, so that it would be suffering involved. The king firing up the crematory to 7 times its normal heat would have meant instant death for these men. And secondly, the hot fire, and the king could have not known this at all, was actually going to enhance the miracle that was going to take place. And so the king looks into the furnace, and instead of these 3 crispy critters, which he thought that he would find, he sees 3 men still dressed, not tied, walking around in the fire, along with another person that the king immediately recognized as a deity. And he calls into the furnace, and he calls each man by name. Verse 26. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothing was not scorched, and they didn't even smell of smoke. Here's our last truth for today. When we stand firm in our faith, God will deliver us. He may deliver us in this life. He may deliver us in death. But when he shows up in a big way. Look how God has worked this out. He allows this pagan king to build a statue of himself. He allows him to send invitations and get all these influential people around to worship this image. But instead, all the people gathered around got to see what the God of Israel could do. Don't you imagine there was a buzz going on that day? These men walked out of the fire. Their hair wasn't singed. Their clothing wasn't scorched, and they didn't even smell like smoke. Listen, that smell of smoke is something that's hard to get out of things. If you've been out in the backyard barbecuing, you're going to smell like smoke. If you've been out near a fire, you're going to smell like smoke. If you smoke cigarettes, you're going to smell like smoke. When I was looking for a car, I got an Auto Trader, and I found this little Volkswagen out at a dealer in Houston, Texas. I liked everything about it. I liked all the pictures, but there was one thing I didn't know. And I called the salesman. I said, go sit in that car for about 5 minutes and let me know whether anyone has smoked in there. I said, I don't care how many chemicals you put in it, I will be able to tell. Smoke smell is hard to get out. Well, to show the thoroughness of the miracle and the extreme and the specific power of God, the men not only were not consumed, but they didn't look like or smell like they had been near a fire. And we have to say this. Throughout history, there's been thousands of people who have stood firm in their faith, and the outcome was not as pleasant. Many have lost their lives standing firm. But they trusted God's plan, and that somehow or another, God was bigger than what was happening. Somehow and in some way, God used their deaths to further his plans. Well, unfortunately, even a miracle like this is not enough to convince someone to believe. Verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defiled the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speaks a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Well, that sounds really great. It sounds like a really great statement, but the reality is the king had just placed the God of Israel among all the other gods. He wasn't convinced still that there was one true God. He did, however, add the worship of Yahweh to the approved state religions, and he threatened anyone who would speak against the God of Israel. But listen, there's no telling how many people gathered there that day did conclude that a God who could deliver these three men out of the fiery furnace was indeed the true God to be worshipped. And now they were free to do it with no repercussions. The story ends on a happy note, with the asbestos triplets back in the good graces of the king and were promoted in their jobs to even higher positions. The story has this feel-good ending, the ending that we wanted. But we know that life doesn't always turn out that way when we stand firm in our faith. Nevertheless,